Nathan, I choose and called you for a purpose.
No! Leave me alone!
He was the best surgeon in the state. His hands had saved thousands of lives. But on the night God finally spoke to him, Dr. Nathan Reeves looked up at the ceiling of his empty office and said one word: no. He did not know that single word would cost him his career, his reputation, his home, and almost his marriage. He did not know that the woman he barely loved would be the only one standing beside him when everything fell apart, and he could never have imagined that the same God he mocked would one day hand him back more than he ever lost. This is the story of a man who said no to heaven and paid a price no medical degree could prepare him for. Before we continue, if this is your first time here, welcome to When God Called. We tell true-to-life stories of ordinary people who met an extraordinary God. If stories like this move you, please subscribe, drop a comment, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Your subscription genuinely helps this channel grow, and it costs you nothing but means everything to us. Now, let's get back to Nathan's story. Nathan Reeves grew up in a small house on the edge of Cedar Falls, Ohio, the son of a mother who cleaned houses and a father who left before Nathan turned 6. His grandmother raised him more than his mother did, and she was the one who dragged him to church every Sunday in a stiff-collared shirt he despised. Nathan hated those pews. He hated the preacher's voice rising and falling like a performance. He hated the way the congregation would clap for a God who, in Nathan's eyes, had done nothing for his family. The house they lived in had a leaking roof that his grandmother patched with tar every spring, and Nathan remembers lying awake as a boy, listening to rain drip into a metal bucket, wondering why a God who supposedly loved them let the roof leak at all. He remembers the shame of second-hand shoes, the quiet humiliation of school lunches paid for by a program everyone in class knew meant your family had nothing. When Nathan was 12, his grandmother fell sick with a fever that no doctor in town could explain. He remembers kneeling beside her bed, praying the way she taught him, begging God to heal her. He remembers the smell of the small bedroom, medicine and sweat and the candle she kept burning by her Bible. He remembers holding her hand and promising God he would do anything, believe anything, if only she would open her eyes one more morning. She died 3 days later, on a Thursday, while Nathan was at school being told by a teacher that everything happens for a reason. Nathan never prayed again after that day. He decided, somewhere in his young heart, that if there was a God, he was either powerless or cruel, and Nathan wanted nothing to do with either kind. He stopped going to church the following Sunday, and no one in his house had the strength left to make him go back. That grief became the engine of his ambition. Nathan studied harder than anyone in his class, driven by a need to control what God, in his mind, had refused to control. Teachers noticed the shift in him, the quiet, grieving boy who suddenly could not be beaten in a science exam, who read medical textbooks checked out from the library long before he understood half the words in them. He told himself that if he became skilled enough, precise enough, he would never again have to stand helpless beside a bed, watching someone he loved slip away. He got into medical school on a scholarship, graduated at the top of his class, and by the time he was 34, he was one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the Midwest. Patients called him a miracle worker. Colleagues called him brilliant. Nathan called himself proof that a man did not need faith to save lives. He built his identity on being the opposite of everything his grandmother believed. Where she trusted a God she could not see, Nathan trusted his own 2 hands, his own steady mind, and the machines humming beside his operating table. He believed he had already outgrown the need for anything divine. He kept a small photograph of his grandmother in his wallet for years, not out of sentiment, he told himself, but as a reminder of exactly what helplessness looked like, and exactly what he had promised himself he would never become again. But brilliance in the operating room did not translate into goodness at home. Nathan married Claire Whitfield when he was 30, not because he loved her the way a husband should love a wife, but because she was steady, quiet, and undemanding, and because a surgeon with a wife looked respectable at hospital galas. Claire had grown up 2 towns over, the daughter of a deacon, and she had loved Nathan since the first year of his residency, when he was still young enough to laugh easily, and hadn't yet built the walls that would later define him. Claire loved him fully, the kind of love that noticed when he skipped meals and remembered how he liked his coffee, that kept his shirts pressed and his schedule organized without ever being asked. Nathan barely noticed her at all. He came home late, spoke little, and treated their marriage like another item on a long list of professional obligations. Claire told herself it would get better once he wasn't so busy. She did not yet know that busyness was not Nathan's real problem. The real problem revealed itself slowly. Then, all at once. Nathan had begun seeing other women years before, starting with a nurse during his residency, then a hospital administrator, then women he met at conferences in cities where nobody knew his name. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was simply what successful men did to release the pressure of saving lives every day. He was careful, controlled, methodical, the same way he was in surgery. He kept separate phones for a period of time, deleted messages with the same precision he used closing an incision, and calculated his schedule so that no two women ever crossed paths. He never let the affairs touch his work, and for a long time, he never let them touch his conscience either. He convinced himself that a man who saved lives had earned the right to take what he wanted from his own. Claire suspected something was wrong long before she had proof. She noticed the late nights that didn't match his call schedule, the phone he angled away from her, the coldness that crept into a marriage that had never been warm to begin with. She noticed the way he flinched when she asked simple questions about his day, the way his answers grew shorter the longer they were married, rather than longer. Some nights she lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had done wrong, wondering if loving him harder might somehow fix whatever was broken between them. Still, she stayed, praying quietly in a house where her husband did not believe prayer changed anything at all, holding on to a hope that had no evidence behind it except her own stubborn faith. It happened on a Tuesday night in late October, during a surgery that should have been routine. A 61-year-old man named Walter Simmons was on Nathan's table for a triple bypass, a procedure Nathan had performed hundreds of times without incident. Walter was a retired school teacher, a grandfather of 6, a man whose chart Nathan had barely glanced at beyond the numbers that mattered to the surgery itself. Halfway through, Walter's heart stopped responding the way it should have. The monitors screamed. The team around Nathan moved fast, calling out numbers, adjusting, fighting to bring Walter back. Nathan worked with the same cold precision he always did, hands steady even as the room grew tense, sweat beading beneath his surgical cap, though the operating room stayed cold as always. But somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Nathan heard something that had nothing to do with the monitors or the team around him. A voice, calm and unmistakable, spoke directly into the center of his chest. It said, "I called you for more than this." Nathan nearly dropped his instruments. He looked around the room, certain someone else had spoken, but every face was locked on Walter, no one paying him any attention at all. The voice did not repeat itself, but it did not need to. Something about it settled into Nathan's bones, in a way no anesthesia ever could, a certainty that reached past his training and his skepticism both. Walter's heart steadied moments later, and the surgery ended in success, another life saved, another triumph for the surgeon who did not believe in miracles. But Nathan walked out of that operating room shaken in a way his colleagues had never seen. A nurse asked if he was all right, and he brushed past her without answering, locking himself in the small office reserved for attending physicians, sitting in the dark for nearly an hour before he trusted his hands enough to drive home. He told no one what happened. He convinced himself it was exhaustion, stress, the residue of too many sleepless nights layered on top of an old childhood memory he had buried for decades. He told himself surgeons under pressure sometimes imagined things, that the mind under stress played tricks even on the most disciplined of men. The voice did not stay buried, though. Over the following weeks, it returned in fragments, always at the strangest moments. Once while he was scrubbing in before a procedure, a thought entered his mind that was not his own, clear and specific. Your hands were made for more than money. Another time, driving home past midnight from a house that was not his own, he felt an overwhelming conviction settle over him, a certainty that his life had drifted far from whatever purpose it was meant to carry. He pulled his car onto the shoulder of an empty road that night and sat there for nearly 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, unable to explain to himself why his chest felt so tight. Nathan began having dreams, vivid and repetitive, of standing in front of people in places that looked nothing like an American hospital. Dusty roads, makeshift clinics, faces marked by poverty and disease. In every dream, he was healing people, not with machines and monitors, but with his hands alone. And somehow, it felt like the healing came from somewhere beyond him. He would wake from these dreams disoriented, reaching for a reality that felt suddenly less solid than it had before. Claire asleep beside him, unaware of the storm quietly building inside her husband's mind. Nathan told himself these were simply signs of burnout. He scheduled a vacation he never took. He buried himself deeper in his work and deeper into the arms of women who asked no questions and expected nothing lasting from him, using distraction the way other men used alcohol, hoping enough noise would drown out a silence that kept finding him anyway. But the calling did not fade. If anything, it grew louder, more specific, until one night, sitting alone in his office, long after the hospital had emptied, Nathan finally admitted to himself what he had refused to say out loud. Something, or someone, was calling him away from the life he built, towards something he could not explain, could not control, and absolutely did not want. He thought of his grandmother's God, the one who let her die despite his prayers, the one he had spent 30 years proving he did not need. He thought of everything he had built with his own 2 hands, the awards, the reputation, the respect of an entire medical community that had no idea how empty he felt underneath it. And sitting there in the dark, Nathan made his choice. He said no, out loud, to an empty office, the same way a man might refuse a job offer he found beneath him, not realizing he was refusing the only offer that could have saved everything he was about to lose. Nathan's refusal did not end the calling, but it did begin something else entirely, a slow unraveling of the life he had spent 2 decades building. It started with Walter Simmons, the very patient whose surgery had first carried that voice into Nathan's chest. 3 months after his recovery, Walter died suddenly, of complications the hospital's review board determined were linked to an error during the original procedure, an error that had gone unnoticed and unreported. Nathan swore he had done nothing wrong, replaying the surgery in his mind night after night, certain his hands had been steady, certain his technique had been flawless. But the paperwork told a different story, one that implicated a moment of distraction the review board could not explain, and Nathan refused to admit to. A moment buried in the exact minutes that voice had spoken to him. The hospital opened a formal investigation. His name, once printed on award plaques in the lobby, was suddenly attached to a malpractice case that made the local news. Reporters called his office. Colleagues who once sought his opinion in the hallway now avoided eye contact. Walter's family, grieving and furious, hired a lawyer who painted Nathan not as a brilliant surgeon, but as a reckless one. A narrative that spread faster than Nathan could counter it. While the investigation dragged on, Nathan's personal life began collapsing at the same time, as if held together by the same failing structure. One of the women he had been seeing, a hospital administrator named Denise, grew tired of being a secret and sent Claire a message laying out the entire affair, timelines, hotel receipts, screenshots of messages Nathan thought he had deleted. Claire read every word standing in her own kitchen, the phone shaking slightly in her hand, the life she thought she understood dissolving in front of her. She did not scream, she did not throw anything. She simply sat down at the table and stared at the wall for a long time, trying to reconcile the man she married with the stranger those messages described. When Nathan came home that night, Claire was waiting, and for the first time in their marriage, she asked him a question he could not talk his way around. The confrontation that followed stripped away every excuse Nathan had built over the years. He admitted to Denise. Then, pressed further, he admitted to others before her, a string of women stretching back almost to the beginning of their marriage. He watched Claire's face change with every name, watched the last pieces of the woman he married harden into something he did not recognize. Claire listened in silence, her hands folded in her lap, tears falling without sound. She did not leave that night, though every instinct told her she should. Something in her, some quiet conviction she could not fully explain, told her to stay, to pray, to wait and see what God intended to do with a man who had spent his whole life running from him. Nathan mistook her silence for weakness. He did not yet understand that her staying was the strongest thing she had ever done. The malpractice case reached its verdict 2 months later. The hospital's board, under pressure from the family's lawyers and a public that had turned against him, voted to terminate Nathan's employment and report the incident to the state medical board. His license was suspended pending further review, a review that dragged on for over a year with no clear resolution. Word spread through the medical community faster than Nathan could control it, and doors that had once opened for him now closed without explanation. Colleagues who once praised his skill stopped returning his calls. Invitations to conferences disappeared. A younger surgeon named Marcus Boyd, who had once considered Nathan a mentor, quietly took over his patients and, within a year, his position as head of the department, never once reaching out to check on the man who had trained him. The affair became public knowledge within his social circle not long after, thanks to Denise's own bitterness, and Nathan found himself abandoned by nearly everyone who had once called him a friend. He lost his position, his income, his reputation, and very nearly his marriage, all within the span of a single devastating year. If you're just joining us, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We read every single one, and it helps us understand just how far these stories are reaching. Now, back to Nathan and Claire. With his license suspended and his savings drained by legal fees, Nathan sold the house on Ashford Lane that Claire had decorated with such care over the years. They moved into a small rented apartment across town, a space that felt suffocating after the life Nathan once thought he deserved. Boxes sat unpacked for months in the corner of their new living room, a visible reminder of a life he was not yet ready to accept had ended. He spent his days in silence, staring at ceilings, replaying the voice he had heard in that operating room, wondering if refusing it had somehow unlocked every disaster that followed. Pride kept him from admitting the connection out loud, but in the quiet hours of the night, Nathan could not escape the feeling that something greater than bad luck had reached into his life and begun dismantling it piece by piece. Claire, meanwhile, made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her story, including herself. She did not file for divorce. She did not pack her things and disappear to her sister's house in Columbus, though her sister begged her to, calling weekly, with a fresh argument for why Claire owed Nathan nothing anymore. Instead, Claire took a job at a local elementary school, teaching second grade for a fraction of what Nathan used to earn in a single week, and she used that income to keep food on their table while Nathan searched for any way to rebuild his career. Friends questioned her judgment. Family members called her foolish for staying with a man who had betrayed her so completely. Claire had no defense for her decision that made logical sense. All she had was a quiet, stubborn conviction that God was not finished writing this story, and that her staying was somehow part of what he intended to write. Claire's faith had always been steady, even when Nathan mocked it privately or ignored it entirely. She had grown up in a small Baptist church in Kentucky, the daughter of a deacon who taught her that love was patient even when it was not deserved. She did not excuse what Nathan had done. She grieved it, wept over it in private, some nights unable to look at him without remembering every name Denise's message had listed, some nights driving to the church parking lot alone, just to sit in her car and cry, where Nathan could not see her. But she began praying for Nathan with a new kind of desperation, not the polite prayers of a comfortable life, but the raw, aching prayers of a woman watching her marriage and her husband both collapse in real time. She asked God for one thing above all else, that whatever was happening to Nathan would end in his surrender, not his destruction. Nathan noticed her prayers, though he never joined her in them. He would watch her some nights, kneeling by their bed with her eyes closed, whispering words he could not fully hear, and something about her stubborn devotion unsettled him more than any conversation could have. He began to wonder what kind of love could survive what he had done to her. He had nothing left to offer Claire. No money, no status, no charm strong enough to distract from his failures, and yet she remained, cooking dinner in their small kitchen, grading papers at their small table, praying beside their small bed. Slowly, without either of them naming it, Claire's presence became the only stable thing left in Nathan's collapsing world, and it began to crack something open in him that his pride had kept sealed for years. The state medical board's decision came 14 months after the initial investigation began, and it was worse than Nathan had allowed himself to imagine. His license, which had been suspended pending review, was formally revoked, the board citing a pattern of negligence they claimed extended beyond the Walter Simmons case into 2 other incidents Nathan had never even been aware were under scrutiny. Just like that, 20 years of training, sacrifice, and surgical mastery were erased with a single letter delivered to his door. Nathan sat on the floor of their small apartment that afternoon, the letter in his hands, and felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Not anger, not defensiveness, just an overwhelming, crushing emptiness, the kind that made him question whether his entire life had meant anything at all. The months that followed were the darkest Nathan had ever known. Unable to practice medicine anywhere in the country, he took a job stocking shelves at a hardware store, under a manager half his age, a humiliation that stripped away the last shreds of his identity. Customers sometimes recognized him from the old news coverage, whispering behind aisles he was restocking, and Nathan learned to keep his head down and his answers short. He drank more than he ever had, alone most nights, since the women who once filled his evenings had long since vanished, along with his money and his reputation. He stopped sleeping properly. He stopped eating regularly. Claire watched him disappear into himself, a shell of the confident surgeon she had married. And though her heart broke watching it happen, she never stopped praying, never stopped showing up, never stopped believing that this collapse was not the end of Nathan's story. One night, roughly a year and a half after he first heard that voice in the operating room, Nathan reached the lowest point of his entire life. Sitting alone in the dark garage of their apartment building, surrounded by boxes he had never bothered to unpack, he found himself thinking thoughts he never imagined a man like him would think, wondering if the world would simply be better without him in it. He thought of his grandmother, the woman whose death had first convinced him God either did not exist or did not care. He thought of Walter Simmons, the patient whose death had triggered his downfall. He thought of Claire, asleep upstairs, still praying for a man who had given her nothing but pain. And somewhere in that garage, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had built, Nathan finally stopped running. He did not remember deciding to pray. It simply happened, the way breath happens, involuntary and desperate. He said words he had not spoken since he was 12 years old, kneeling beside his grandmother's deathbed, begging a God he was no longer sure existed to do something, anything, to prove he was real. "If you're actually there," Nathan whispered into the darkness of that garage, his voice breaking in a way it never had in any operating room, "then take whatever is left of me, because I have nothing left to protect." He did not hear a voice this time. There was no dramatic clap of thunder, no blinding light, but something shifted in Nathan that night, a surrender settling into the same chest that once carried nothing but pride, and for the first time in his adult life, Nathan Reeves stopped fighting the God he had spent 30 years refusing to believe in. Nathan told Claire what happened the next morning, sitting across from her at their small kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He expected her to be skeptical, given how many times he had disappointed her before. Instead, Claire simply reached across the table and took his hand, tears filling her eyes as she told him she had been praying for exactly this moment for over a year. It was not an instant transformation. Nathan did not wake up the next day as a different man, free of every flaw that had led him there. But something had genuinely changed in him. A willingness to be honest that had never existed before. A humility that came from losing absolutely everything he once used to define himself. Nathan began attending church with Claire, awkwardly at first, sitting in the back pew of a small congregation, not unlike the one his grandmother had dragged him to as a boy. He found himself listening differently now, not with the resentment of a child who felt abandoned, but with the attention of a man who had run out of other options. He started reading the Bible Claire had kept on her nightstand for years, untouched by him until now, underlining passages that spoke directly to the wreckage he had made of his own life. He asked the pastor questions after service, uncomfortable questions about suffering and grace, and whether a God who allowed his grandmother to die could still be trusted. The pastor, a patient man named Reverend Thomas Ellery, did not offer easy answers. He simply told Nathan that faith was not the absence of pain, but the decision to trust God through it, and that lesson settled into Nathan slowly, over months of honest, sometimes painful conversation. With his medical license still revoked, Nathan began volunteering at a free clinic on the edge of town, one that served uninsured families who had nowhere else to turn. He was not allowed to perform surgery or prescribe medication, but he could take blood pressure, offer basic first aid, and sit with frightened patients in ways he never once bothered to do during his years as a celebrated surgeon. For the first time in his career, Nathan found himself genuinely listening to his patients, learning their names, their fears, their stories, rather than treating them as problems to be solved efficiently. An elderly widow at the clinic once told Nathan she hadn't had anyone look her in the eye and ask about her day in over a year, and Nathan drove home that night, unable to stop thinking about how many years he had spent doing surgery on people whose names he never bothered to learn. The work paid nothing, but it gave Nathan something his old career never had, a sense that he was finally using his hands for the purpose that voice in the operating room had once described. Nathan and Claire's marriage slowly began rebuilding during this season, not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent choices. Nathan started coming home for dinner every night, no matter how tired he was from his volunteer shifts. He began asking Claire about her day, really asking, and actually listening to her answers. He apologized, not once but repeatedly, understanding finally the depth of what his betrayal had cost her. Claire, for her part, chose forgiveness in stages, some days easier than others, working through her pain with a counselor at their church who helped her process the anger she had buried beneath her prayers. It took nearly 2 years for trust to return between them, but slowly, painfully, honestly, it did. 3 years after Nathan's license was revoked, the state medical board reopened his case following new evidence submitted by a former colleague who had reviewed Walter Simmons' original file and discovered the error had actually originated in a mislabeled medication chart, not in anything Nathan had done during surgery. The board's finding was a stunning reversal, formally clearing Nathan of the negligence that had ended his career, though the years of suspension and revocation could never be given back. Nathan's license was reinstated, but he was no longer the same man who had lost it. He returned to medicine slowly, choosing to work first at a community hospital rather than chasing the prestige that once defined him, treating his restored career as a stewardship rather than a possession. Around this same time, after nearly a decade of marriage without children, something Claire had quietly grieved for years, while never once blaming Nathan for the years he spent unfaithful rather than present, they learned Claire was pregnant. The pregnancy came as a genuine surprise to both of them, doctors having told Claire years earlier that conceiving naturally was unlikely, given complications discovered during a routine exam. Nathan wept when Claire told him, not the composed tears of a man performing emotion for an audience, but the raw, grateful weeping of someone who understood exactly how much grace had been extended to him. Their daughter, Hannah, was born the following spring, and 18 months later, their son, Caleb, followed. Nathan, who once could not be bothered to remember his wife's schedule, became a father who read bedtime stories every single night he was home, who sat on the floor of the nursery at 2 a.m, simply to watch his children sleep, still amazed that any of it had been given back to him. Nathan's reputation as a physician was gradually restored, but it looked nothing like the reputation he once chased. Patients at the community hospital spoke of his patience, his willingness to sit with families through difficult diagnoses, his habit of praying quietly before difficult surgeries, a practice that would have been unthinkable for the man he used to be. Word of his skill spread slowly at first, then rapidly, as complex cases other surgeons had turned away found their way to Nathan's operating table, and his outcomes began attracting attention from medical journals and eventually from international conferences. Within a decade, Nathan Reeves was recognized not merely as a skilled cardiothoracic surgeon, but as one of the leading voices in his field. Invited to speak and operate in hospitals across multiple continents, his name now synonymous with both surgical excellence and quiet integrity. Nathan never forgot the voice that spoke to him in that operating room all those years ago, nor the years of ruin that followed his refusal to listen. He often told the story, when asked by younger doctors or church congregations, of the surgeon who had everything and still felt empty, who said no to a calling he did not understand, and lost nearly everything he thought defined him, before finally surrendering in a dark garage with nothing left to protect. He spoke of Claire often too, the woman who stayed when staying made no sense, whose quiet faith outlasted his loudest failures. Their home, once filled with silence and betrayal, became filled instead with laughter, with Hannah's questions and Caleb's stubborn energy, with a marriage neither of them could have imagined surviving, let alone thriving, a decade before. Nathan Reeves learned, in the hardest way a man can learn anything, that God's calling does not disappear simply because we refuse it. Sometimes it waits patiently on the other side of everything we thought we could not live without. He lost his career, his reputation, and very nearly his marriage, before he finally understood that the voice he heard that night, was never trying to destroy his life, it was trying to save it. Now we want to hear from you. If you were in Nathan's position, standing in that operating room hearing a voice call you towards something you couldn't explain, what would you have done? Leave your answer below in the comment section. We'll catch you on the next story.